It's the Muppets as you've never seen them before.
Everybody on to Hollywood!
In 1979, Jim Henson released The Muppet Movie, a spin-off of the wildly successful Muppet Show that at the time was about to enter its 4th season. Despite the worldwide appeal of the characters, there was still some trepidation as to whether or not that success would translate into the world of cinema. Those worries were quickly put to rest when the film was able to gross $65.2 million at the box office, which was over 7 times its budget. The charming yet philosophical origin story that follows Kermit and friends travelling to Hollywood to achieve their dreams delighted audiences worldwide, being nominated for 2 Academy Awards, a Golden Globe, and winning a Grammy for its soundtrack. The Muppets had conquered the film landscape just as they had done with TV a few years prior, adding yet another branch to the franchise that at the time seemed unstoppable. While The Muppet Show would have its final curtain call in 1981 at the request of Henson, the films would continue with The Great Muppet Caper that same year and Muppets Take Manhattan in 1984, which despite not reaching the heights of the first cinematic outing, still turned a decent profit and received positive reviews from critics. The Muppet mania of the 70s was proving to be still riding high, and in 1985, Jim Henson, writer Jerry Jewell, and fellow Muppet performer Frank Oz began developing a 4th picture titled The Cheapest Muppet Movie Ever Made, centering around Gonzo being placed in the director's chair after Kermit becomes too busy. The former performance artist would write the most outlandish and nonsensical film ever, then immediately blow almost the entire budget on the opening titles, thus causing the film to get progressively cheaper as it continues. While this kind of fourth wall shattering, self-deprecating narrative would have been right at home with the Muppets brand at the time, the film would sadly never see the light of day as Jim Henson would pass away in May of 1990. Bringing the Muppet Parade to a screeching halt. Over the next few years, the remaining Muppet performers and Jim's son, Brian Henson, were left to pick up the pieces and figure out how to keep the Muppets going without their level-headed and compassionate leader. It was during the 90s the Muppets would become less known for their television exploits, with the only series produced being a pseudo-revival of The Muppet Show called Muppets Tonight, which didn't catch on like its predecessor, only running for 22 episodes. Instead, the Muppets would put most of their resources into their film career, releasing 3 movies during the 90s, with the first 2 of these being Muppet takes on literary classics, 1992's The Muppet Christmas Carol and 1996's Muppet Treasure Island. While extremely beloved today, especially the former, both these movies initially weren't all that successful, and taking into account the cost of marketing, may have resulted in a financial loss for the company. By the late 90s, things weren't looking good. The company itself was doing fine. I mean, this was around when they started Bear in the Big Blue House. In terms of the Muppets though, it had been less than a decade since the loss of Jim, and the popularity of the franchise was waning. It was clear whatever they did next would have to be something extraordinary, because it might just be their final chance to save their most beloved property. Here we go again. In 2021, I made a video titled Disney's Muppet Problem, in which I talked about how Disney can't seem to figure out the key to why the Muppets were once so successful. But there's part of this story that often gets overlooked. Why did the Henson children sell to Disney? There's no shortage of online coverage of the Muppets in their heyday, and I've already talked at length about what happened after the buyout, but what about in between? That time from Henson's death in 1990 to Disney's purchase of the Muppets in 2004. Well, I just outlined most of it for you in the intro, because today I want to talk about the final nail in the coffin, so to speak, the film that cemented the Muppets' fate, 1999's Muppets from Space. Of course, as always, there's some kind of personal angle as to why I'm doing this. When I first began the channel, one of the videos I really wanted to do was a full ranking of every single Muppet movie. The reason I never got around to it is because I couldn't figure out where to put Muppets from Space. It's a film I love to no end, yet whenever the topic of Muppet movies comes up, I completely forget it exists. But why is that? Hopefully today I can answer that question. First though, a bit of backstory. Now, this section is going to be a tad shorter than normal because it was hard to dig up a lot of behind the scenes information on this film, mainly dates of when production took place. But the few tidbits I were able to find do give some indicator as to what was the thought process behind making this movie. Writer Kirk Thatcher, who had been with the Muppets since their peak in the late 80s, penned a script titled Muppets in Space, which was very different from the final product. The original pitch saw Kermit being abducted by aliens who believe him to be their leader. This causes the rest of the cast to launch a rescue mission, presumably taking them into the stars. Though one notable thing about this pitch is how there is technically officially released merchandise for it. In May 1998, the company Welch's, which creates jelly glasses, released a set themed around the idea of Muppets in space. What was interesting was this was the very same month the Jim Henson Company announced that they were making a film titled Muppets from Space. They had two potential directions to choose for this film, the one written by Thatcher and the other by Jerry Jewell, which instead focused on aliens looking for Gonzo after seeing transmissions of his performances on The Muppet Show. Gonzo would then start to believe that he too was an alien until he would later learn the truth. In the end, the company would choose the script by Jules, meaning the jelly glasses were now a rare case of merchandise for a movie that was never made. What I think ultimately sealed the deal for Jules' version of the movie is how it was directly inspired by Gonzo's song from the Muppet movie I'm Going to Go Back There Someday, a tragically nostalgic song about wanting to recapture a moment of joy you only knew briefly. This aspect gave his pitch something Thatcher's didn't: an emotional hook. While it would have undoubtedly been very funny and action-packed, Muppets in Space felt sort of gimmicky and didn't really have anything to ground it. The issue with the Muppets in the 90s was that they were trying to go bigger, and in doing so, they lost a lot of that depth and pathos that made the original trilogy so successful. The key to trying to save the Muppets was to go back to simplistic, introspective stories focused around one of the pre-established characters, and Gonzo was the perfect candidate, as he had been at the heart of some of the more sentimental moments in the history of the Muppets. The performance artist turned Daredevil's search for identity was a topic bursting with potential that until now had gone relatively untouched. And with how Gonzo arguably had a bigger role than Kermit in the previous two movies, this development seemed kind of inevitable. Whether they realise it or not, people really do gravitate towards this idea of what it's like being the outcast in a group of outcasts. It also does help that since his very inception, Gonzo is the only Muppet to have been played by one performer, Dave Goelz, who since the character's creation had portrayed him with so much authenticity to a point where beside Kermit, he was the Muppet that felt the most human. And this lean towards charming simplicity could also be seen in the writing process of the film. Co-writer Joseph Mazzarino had contributed to a draft that was very reference heavy, with parodies of Men in Black, Contact, and Alien. These would be taken out when the Henson Company brought in Tim Hill to direct, who would quickly opt to drop the parodies as he felt they intruded on the emotional core of the story, which was about Gonzo figuring out who he is. This also led to the film receiving a much different ending, but we'll get there when we get there. Rather than being produced with Disney like the previous two films, this time the Henson Company would work with Sony's Columbia Pictures, which definitely seemed like a better fit for the Muppets at the time, but it's my belief that choosing Sony to produce and distribute this movie is basically what doomed it. The film was released on July 16th, 1999, and by the end of its run had made $22.3 million at the worldwide box office, against a budget of $24 million, thus making it the lowest performing Muppet movie ever. Critics were also not the least bit fond of it. And today the film is hardly talked about, even among the more die-hard Muppet fans. It seemed to have a lot going for it, yet somewhere along the way it all fell apart and led to the Muppets being in the state they're in now. So let's take a look back at the final classic Muppet movie that also accidentally killed the franchise, as I tell you why Muppets from Space was almost perfect. The film centres around the Muppets all living together in a big suburban house that's just as hectic and crazy as you'd imagine. But Gonzo is feeling very out of place as the only whatever, and even surrounded by all his friends, can't help but feel alone. Things change when Gonzo starts seeing strange messages that no one else is aware of, and after an out-of-body experience, comes to the conclusion that he is an alien from out of space. So he starts to prepare for the arrival of his brethren, making a spectacle out of himself in the process. Unfortunately, this also gets the attention of a government agent who takes Gonzo, and Rizzo, away to question him and eventually remove his brain. And now it's up to Kermit, Miss Piggy, Fozzie, Animal, and Pepe to sneak into the facility and rescue their friend, while also trying to learn if there are really otherworldly beings on their way to Earth. The writing of this movie fascinates me in how it's able to be so strikingly different from every other Muppet production, yet still seem wholly authentic and genuine in its depictions of these characters, some of which were over 20 years old by this point. You can almost feel this sense to try and update the Muppets with the times. Now the Muppets act more like a standard American family. An extensively extensive one, but still much more laid back than how we're used to seeing them. If you go into this movie expecting to see the iconic banjo-playing frog, you're probably going to be disappointed. Though while they certainly seem more homogenized on the outlook, once you spend a little time with them, you'll see the core essence has remained intact. Kermit is still the straight man trying to keep everything together while being faced with outlandish occurrences at every turn. Piggy is still a diva for the spotlight and absolute icon. It's simply shifted from movie stardom to journalism. The closest thing I can compare it to is the Looney Tunes show, taking classic characters and placing them in a modern setting while still being recognisable and finding ways of adapting their personalities to fit the new setting and tone. So while they aren't putting on a show anymore, the Muppets' personalities have not been diluted and remain their off-the-wall selves. And I do like this idea of the Muppets all living together in this one giant house. It really does sell the whole big, wacky, found family idea, and it's a concept I wish we got to see more often. Simple things like having them say hello while gathering at the table for breakfast just makes it all feel very cozy, as if you're a part of these moments. Though there is also a downside, because it isn't only the classic Muppet Show gang, as this film also brings in all the Muppets Tonight characters into the fold, which, while I enjoy a lot of these guys, they do take up quite a bit of screen time, and we don't get as many standout moments from the more recognisable characters. Like Sam, Swedish Chef, and the rest of the Electric Mayhem besides Animal are hardly in the film. Obviously it was difficult, as coming to the end of the 90s, there wasn't a lot of the old guard left. But it feels weird seeing all these beloved characters essentially getting phased out for the cast of a failed TV show. Except for Bobo. Bobo is great. Can't get enough of this guy. Earlier I said the key to saving the Muppets would be focusing on simplicity, and I feel that was very true when it comes to the visual effects. The movie is able to capture the same low-budget feel of the Henson trilogy in the best way, with it mostly still being practical. Though here is where they started to embrace CGI a lot more, but unlike the previous films where it was innocuous and used sparingly, here it is glaringly obvious and looks out of place. I mean, look at this, it's like a PowerPoint transition. This film mostly isn't trying to wow you with revolutionary special effects or massive set pieces. It knows the focus needs to stay on the characters and the story. And it was good they understood that, because in certain cases, this is the most compelling some of these characters have ever been. Everyone has their moments, but it really is Gonzo and his conflict that carries the whole thing. There's always something powerful about characters who champion their uniqueness, dealing with loneliness and confronting what being the only one actually means. The film never loses this focus and goes in detail when exploring Gonzo's isolation. As I said, Gonzo is likely the most interesting of the Muppets because of the simple idea of being the odd one out in a group of misfits is so compelling. Tell me the scene where he looks at the photo on the beach doesn't break your heart, though it makes you wonder why would he even have that taken. It's Gonzo, he probably thought it was artistic at the time. The movie opens with a poignant yet still funny dream sequence where Gonzo is denied entry onto Noah's Ark because he's the only one of his kind. And it so brilliantly demonstrates how expertly the film walks the fine line between having Gonzo be entertaining with his dangerous and unhinged escapades, yet still highlighting the tragedy. Something like that requires so much nuance, and Dave Goelz strikes that right balance. Even when Gonzo goes off the deep end, you still sense the genuine excitement he feels over not being the only one of him out there, which makes it hit that much harder when it all starts crashing down. Of course, there's also the, coding.
Kermit, I realize that it may be hard for you to accept me as an alien, but I didn't choose to be one. And, well, I've always had alien tendencies, and this just makes sense to me.
Gonzo is commonly the favourite Muppet among the LGBTQIA+ community, but that goes far beyond simply being self-identified as a whatever. Perhaps more than any other character in fiction, Gonzo is a champion of uniqueness and refusing to conform to society's expectations. Everything from his fashion sense to his fiery passion for everything life throws at him. He's this little weirdo who isn't bogged down by labels and refuses to let anyone tell him how to live his life. But this movie digs a little deeper into it, where we basically see Gonzo go on a quest for identity, because that's how it can truly feel sometimes. Even if you don't feel the need for a label and are mostly happy living your life without it, you'll still often feel this pressure to find something because society still wants us to fit into a box. But there's also room for a much deeper queer analysis of Muppets from Space. How Gonzo is ecstatic to learn there might be others like him out there, which I don't really think I have to explain why that would resonate with queer audiences, and the thrill of having discovered this missing piece about yourself. Kermit and Gonzo's relationship has always been one of the most wholesome, and this is the first time since The Muppet Show I feel it's gotten to be properly explored. I adore how the film portrays Kermit. He's still the leader, but has become a bit more laid back. It's clear that he wants to help Gonzo, but he doesn't know the right thing to say. But at the same time, we see the lengths he will go to for his friend, even if he isn't really able to understand.
You know what you are, Gonzo?
What?
Distinct.
This is arguably the first time we really saw Steve Whitmire's version of the character in a movie. Since this is the first time he's being Kermit, and not Kermit playing a classic literary character. While it's clear that the edges have started to be smoothed down a bit, I don't see it as an issue here, because Jim Henson's more neurotic and explosive Kermit would not fit the tone this film goes for. Second to that is Whitmire's other character, Rizzo. Throughout the 90s, Rizzo had taken the role of Gonzo's best friend and sidekick. I don't know how the writers came up with putting these two together, but they fell in love with this dynamic, which is why it's pretty much the only thing brought over from the storybook movies. And personally, this is the only time I've ever felt Rizzo was a fully formed character, showing how much he really cares for Gonzo. But Rizzo has now also been paired up with Pepe, who, to be honest, I'm not very fond of. He's a fine background Muppet with a cool design, but I never get why the writers keep trying to force him into the main group. What is the real joke of his character outside of non-American accent funny? I'm just saying there's a reason he was barely in the 2011 movie or Most Wanted. But what does Pepe add to this movie, other than taking away screen time from more beloved Muppets? This is Frank Oz's final time performing as Fozzie and Miss Piggy in a major Muppet production, yet Fozzie only makes brief cameos for a third of the movie, and Miss Piggy doesn't do anything notable until 23 minutes in. And it's a shame because Piggy is on top form in this movie. After only playing very minor roles in Christmas Carol and Treasure Island, she has come back in full force, and I am delighted to see her in her element again, taking every opportunity to steal the spotlight and proving she is a force to be reckoned with. And while Oz still sounds perfect as Piggy, his Fozzie voice has definitely gotten a little raspier over the years.
What is this? A secret communication device?
No, that's Scotch tape. Very useful if something tears.
Ah!
And excuse me while I force you all to listen to my headcanons regarding Miss Piggy in this particular film, because ever since these characters started appearing on screen together, Miss Piggy has never been shy of showing her distaste for Gonzo, even when compared to how she treats the rest of the Muppets. So when this happened, I was a little taken aback.
Hey, wait a minute. You're not part of that alien protection agency. Who are you? Hey, why are you taking Gonzo? Hey.
Now, the obvious reading of this moment is that Piggy needs to interview Gonzo to get the position of lead anchorwoman at the station. But when you look at how the scene was written and how Frank Oz performs the line, I can't help but feel in this moment Piggy was even slightly worried about Gonzo's safety. Though don't get it twisted, this is still classic self-centered Piggy.
Listen, everyone, listen. I've got great news. Gonzo has been kidnapped by the government, and it could be a life-threatening situation!
How can that be great news?
Because I've got the story! I've got the story!
This movie in general is hilarious. It doesn't carry the same wit as the classic movies and tends to be a little more lowbrow than one usually expects from these guys, but it's still jam-packed with great gags throughout. Though it is one of those cases where when a joke does fall flat, it hits bedrock. This is a Muppet movie where Hulk Hogan makes a cameo, and the entire joke is that Hulk Hogan is making a cameo in a Muppet movie, to a point where he directly speaks to the audience. And it sticks out when every other celebrity cameo, such as Rob Schneider or Andy McDowell, are actually playing characters and not merely themselves. So what I'm getting at is everything with the Muppets is great, everything else is far more hit or miss with a strong emphasis on the miss. And also, some of this really has not aged well. Like, ish. Maybe almost perfect isn't quite right. The only other thing about the comedy is it's one of those movies that never stops telling jokes. And I mean it never stops telling jokes. Which, as someone who likes quiet moments where characters are allowed to process their feelings, doesn't really appeal to me. Because every time the movie looks like it's gearing itself up for an emotional moment, it then gets circumvented by another joke, as though just letting the characters sit and think for a few more seconds would be a crime. I find it funny how the film tries to go for this sort of groovy 60s and 70s vibe, because pretty much every aspect of this movie screams that it was made in the late 90s. Whether or not that's a good thing is entirely up to you. I have mixed feelings on it, in that I still appreciate the movie for how it's trying to be a little bit different. We'll likely never see jokes like these in a Muppet production ever again, which does add some novelty to it. And they do have some fun with 90s tropes, like with the espionage elements and the funny spy gadgets. The villain of this film is so boring that I'm mostly sure that was the point. Sort of a kind of comment on how dull these kind of antagonists are, while also playing to the guy's strengths of being the most uncharismatic man in the universe. But it still doesn't change the fact I have no fun watching him, and not even Bobo being present can save it. Like, Tex Richmond from the 2011 movie is a cookie-cutter villain who only cares about money and power, yet they still find ways to have fun with him and make him at least somewhat entertaining. They try and draw some parallels between Ed and Gonzo, but they feel very surface level and don't really say anything new about either character. The soundtrack, consisting of licensed songs, gives the movie a unique vibe, but ultimately harms the story and emotional beats. A lot of the songs seem to come out of nowhere and have very little connection to what's actually happening in the story. They also feel very intrusive when they play during potential emotional moments.
Stop the bus! I'll get there by myself.
No, wait, Gonzo, wait. Look, it doesn't matter what we believe. I mean, if you believe that you need to go and meet your alien brothers, then I say we're going to the beach. Right, guys?
To the beach, okay?
To the beach!
It's hard to get wrapped up in Kermit's concern for Gonzo's well-being while we watch him seemingly lose his marbles when Get Up Off of That Thing is blaring in the background. The only time I think a licensed song choice works in this film is when they play Survival while Rizzo and the lab rats are being tested on. It's still very uninspired, but at least it somewhat relates to what's happening on screen. The lack of original music removes part of the very essence of the Muppets. These characters are supposed to sing and dance, and that is the only way the film majorly misses the mark. I know I've said this countless times, but the point of songs in musicals is to convey information about the characters they wouldn't reveal otherwise. When done right, like the previous Muppet films, A song is a look into a character's psyche that can help convey their turmoil and pain better than mere words ever could. And in a movie that's meant to be telling this incredibly personal story about Gonzo, it feels like it can still go further. But maybe I'm merely biased because Gonzo always has the best songs. And I get the feeling this was Sony's doing because they feel so forced and don't add anything. Licensed music has always been part of the Muppets' identity from the beginning, but the difference there was the characters were singing them because they were performing a stage show. If the Muppets ever did a pre-existing song, it was always one that felt like a natural fit for the characters. When Rolf sings Coddleston Pie, you get why he's connected to it, and a sense of, oh, yeah, of course this is one of his favourite songs, because it was mostly just the Muppet performers singing their favourite songs. The songs in Muppets from Space don't have anything to say about the characters or what's happening in the story, and just feel like an afterthought. As for the film's musical score, it's serviceable. It's mostly these ambient atmospheric tracks, you know, the classic Star Trek otherworldly type sound. Though when the music wants to, it can pull out all the stops and deliver some powerful compositions that heighten the emotions, especially towards the end. All the characters end up at the beach, which allows us to close the film's various subplots one by one until all that remains is Gonzo and Kermit. When it looks like the aliens aren't going to show up, the crowd starts to turn on Gonzo, but then they arrive as it's revealed Gonzo is an alien. Now, the original ending of this film would have contained the reveal that the aliens weren't actually the same species as Gonzo, and were instead merely getting signals of Muppet Show episodes and chose their form to resemble Gonzo as they perceived him to be the ultimate being. In the end, Gonzo would be revealed to not be an alien, but realise his true family has always been the other Muppets. Personally, I would have preferred this ending with Gonzo remaining merely a whatever. Learning what he actually is kind of ruins some of his charm, in concept. However, in execution, I do think ultimately the film sticks the landing when it comes to ending Gonzo's story. Gonzo is welcomed back by his brethren by being shot out of a cannon. Then Ed shows up, tries to kill Gonzo, fails miserably, and due to the ensuing buffoonery is made the ambassador of the aliens' planet. But then it's time for them to be heading off, and they want Gonzo to go with them, meaning he would have to leave behind everything.
And Kermit, you're the best friend any alien could ask for.
Well, we love you, Gonzo.
When he takes one final look back, Gonzo decides to decline the offer.
Thank you for going to so much trouble to find me. But I can't go. I love these guys. My life is here. This is my home.
While I prefer the original ending for keeping the mystery around Gonzo intact, I love this scene so much, because having Gonzo decide to stay feels much more moving than simply him learning he was never an alien. Because in this moment, Gonzo is essentially choosing his found family over his blood relations, which is so damn moving and feels like a satisfying end to Gonzo's arc, as it gives him agency and allows him to figure out what he wants rather than simply being told. What I'm getting at is that the original ending would have been better as a Muppets fan, but in the context of the movie as is, these final moments are beautiful. And when the motif from Gonzo's lament at the start of the film comes back, that is the stuff I live for. And that's pretty much everything. Following Muppets from Space, the franchise would continue falling into irrelevance, with each venture straying further away from the creativity and complexity that propelled these characters into being the biggest names in the world of entertainment. The golden age of the Muppets was officially over, and while there would still be some good things happening, they would never quite reach the heights they did during the 80s. Muppets from Space was branded a failure and quickly written off, with the crew eventually declaring it as non-canon, saying it was merely the Muppets playing themselves in a fictional story and striking all mentions of Gonzo being an alien from the record. Because when you have a franchise that encompasses all possible mediums while also having the characters be these public figures, you exist in this space where everything is canon, but at the same time, nothing is. So if they ever make a mistake, they can simply overrule it as a fictional story starring fictionalized versions of the fictional characters and don't have to deal with the consequences. But how do I feel about it? Well, I think after going through all this, I finally understand why, despite my love for the film, I always blank on it whenever I'm talking about my favourite Muppet productions. To put it simply, Muppets from Space is a great movie, but it doesn't feel like a Muppet movie. Which isn't a bad thing, it's just distinct. The other movies all have this sense of whimsy and this anything goes mentality. Sure, there are plenty of poignant moments, but it all takes place in this heightened reality that complements the characters and the writing. In comparison, Muppets from Space, for a majority of its runtime, is decidedly less fun. It's written and paced like a standard 90s family movie, and really only starts to give into that classic mayhem towards the very end. That, and despite there being more Muppets than ever, the cast feels quite barren, with many staples of the franchise being relegated to cameos and so much screen time dedicated to all these new characters that don't really leave much of an impression. Then there's the lack of original music, which really was the film's death sentence. Ironic that all these things that were done to make the movie stand out are instead what led to it being mostly forgotten. While I consider it the weakest of the Muppets' theatrical outings, there is still so much to love about this film. It wanted to tell a small-scale, introspective story about the world's favourite weirdo going on this journey to find himself, and when the film focuses on that, it is some of the best moments these characters have ever given us. Had they made just a few small tweaks, this could have been the big comeback the Muppets needed, and we'd be living in a very different world right now. Muppets from Space was almost perfect. It just needed to let the Muppets be the Muppets a little bit more. And this wasn't a lesson they learned right away, as this trend of toning down the zaniness of the Muppets would continue, all leading up to the Disney acquisition. For a long time now, I and everyone else have been very critical of Disney and how they've handled the Muppets. I mean, that's what my entire previous video was about. But the issues with the franchise today started long before then. They just didn't do what was needed to fix them. But hey, I still believe there is a brighter future for the Muppets up ahead. The Haunted Mansion special was a great return to form, and the Electric Mayhem series is looking to be another step in the right direction. Because what really matters is, after everything, despite decades of irrelevance, failed projects, and shakeups with the creative team, the Muppets are still here. And it's only a matter of time before they once again find that rainbow connection. But until that day comes, I've been the Gladiator Gladiator, and I am a proud whatever. As always, a massive thank you to the beautiful souls, the Wacky Deli, Jason S, Zombie Rex, ELS Art, Torai Matson, Resplendent Nova, Red Mustached Alien, Jesse James, and all of his reviews and shows for supporting me over on Patreon. If you like what I do and want to help in my effort to grow this channel and improve my content, becoming a patron is the best way to do that. But of course, it's entirely optional, and just watching the stuff I put out there means so much to me. Thanks so much for watching, folks, and I'll see ya real soon.